Hello and welcome to The Print Uninterrupted. I'm Vidisha, the consulting editor for economics at The Print. I'll get straight to what we are going to discuss today. For more than 3 decades, India's growth story has been closely tied to one powerful engine, the IT services exports. Today, the sector generates roughly $225 billion annually, employs millions of skilled professionals, and has shaped the rise of India's urban middle class. But what happens when that engine begins to slow down? In a recent article in the print titled An Economic Sagar Manthan Beckons, my guest today argues that India may be approaching a major structural shift where IT led growth gradually gives way to export led manufacturing as the next driver of the economy. The transition, however, could be uneven, could be disruptive. It may create new winners, in India's industrial towns, while placing pressure on middle class ecosystems that grew around the IT boom. To discuss this important moment in India's economic journey, I'm joined by Saurabh Mukherjea. Just to give a brief introduction about Saurabh, he's the founder and the chief investment officer of Marcellus Investment Managers. He was educated at the London School of Economics. Where he earned a BSc in economics with first class honors and an MSc in economics with distinction in macro and microeconomics. He previously served as CEO of Ambit Capital, and earlier in his career, he co founded Clear Capital in London. He's also a founding director of the Association of Portfolio Managers in India and has been a part of several SEBI working groups reviewing portfolio management regulations. Saurabh, welcome to the print uninterrupted. Your article describes the current moment as an economic sagar manthan, right? A churning that could reshape India's growth model. So let me begin with the central question here. What exactly is the core thesis of your argument? Are we looking at a temporary slowdown in IT, or do you believe India is undergoing a structural transition in its economic growth engine?
So I think the Sagar Manthan phrase I used because in economics we're taught Schumpeterian creative destruction. So I found it very apt that Schumpeter's creative destruction had been preempted by our sages as the ocean of churn. And I think any free market economy, Vidisha, not just India, I think any free market economy, the United States, for instance, goes through these waves of creative destruction. So, for example, in 2020, a bunch of American economists discovered that 80% of the jobs in America in 2020, 80% of the professions didn't exist in 1940. So, in the world's largest economy, after 80 years of reasonably solid progress, 80% of the jobs got displaced and new professions emerged. Right? That's Sagar Mantra on a epic scale. So, as a free market economy, India is bound to go through that. The question is which sectors, when, and so on. And as you're saying, our reading of the situation, my colleague Nandita, who's our economist, and I, our reading of the situation, our travels around the country suggest that we are at that point where we toggle from being IT services led in terms of exports to manufacturing led in terms of exports. It's a big Sagar Manthan. It'll change the structure of our economy. It'll change the priorities of our policymakers. It'll change the identity of the middle class. And that's why we thought, we should write a piece about it and socialize the idea. Other countries have been through the East Asian tigers, for example. The East Asian tigers till the mid 90s were very much export centric countries with very limited domestic consumption, largely capex led and export oriented. The mid 90s Asian crisis meant they had to go through their Sagar Manthan, right? And it's one of those rites of passage that as you approach $4,000, $5,000 per capita income, India is not there yet. We are approaching $3,000 per capita income. But as you approach $4,000, $5,000, typically the economic model of a country has to transition. My reckoning is we are at that point in time where India has to pivot, not because of choice, but because of external forces, specifically the impact of AI on the demand for IT services. Secondly, the impact of the political construct in the developed economies, where politicians are becoming very sensitive to white collar jobs being exported to countries like India. And more commendably for us, there's the sheer size of our outsourcing sector. So India now accounts for 35% of global outsourcing. When we started this journey in IT services in India, it was barely 1 or 2%. So we are now the biggest player in IT services. Western politicians don't like to see their white collar jobs coming to India. Plus, AI means that, just to keep it simple, AI means that JP Morgan type company doesn't need to hire TCS or HCL Tech or Infosys to use ChatGPT, right? And that then means that IT services dwindle as a source of growth in our exports, which in turn means we need to find something else, Vidisha, with which to finance this laptop that I'm doing this podcast with you, or the microphone that is also, I think, imported, or to be fair, my watch, which is also imported, or the iPhone sitting in front of me. We'll have to find, as a country, alternative sources of forex. And once we realized this a year ago, the search began for the sector that will replace IT services and take the country forward.
I mean, you specifically spoke about IT services, of course, AI, but also, I mean, that kind of ties to the India's economic identity. Now, for over 30 years, India's economic identity has been deeply tied to software services exports. As your article points out, IT services have generated over $225 billion annually in foreign exchange. It has created millions of middle class jobs, driven urban consumption in cities such as Bangalore, Hyderabad, Pune, Gurgaon. Would it be fair to say that IT services were not just a successful sector, but the backbone of India's macroeconomic stability for decades?
So clearly, in the post 91 era, everything you said is spot on, right? In the post 91 era, this has been our one big success story, the one sector where we can claim we are world class. We have bright young people coming out of our universities. They join these colossal IT services firms. They get some basic level of training. Then they are flown to the Western money centers, or to the manufacturing hubs in the Western world, where they earn foreign exchange for the country, right? But as we were discussing, right, in every free market economy, nothing lasts forever. Sectors reach maturity, economic forces cause disruption, and an economy moves on. So, just to take a vivid example from our lifetime, till even the 1980s, America was known for manufacturing. Right, America was known as a country where, for everything from chocolates to air conditioners to generators was made. In fact, in 1984, Bruce Springsteen became a superstar singing about blue collar America and its angst and so on. And I was at a certain stage in life where I was impressionable, so I tried to imitate that type of blue jeans, white T-shirt, the American middle class manufacturing look, right, as I call it, right. And the same America today, nobody associates with manufacturing. It's only 40 years since Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA became a super hit. 40 years on, we all associate America with tech, right? America's main export now is tech software, and courtesy Nvidia, now tech hardware as well. So, in the space of a generation and a bit, 40 years, America's transitioned from being primarily manufacturing to primarily being a tech heavy exporter. If after tech you think of anything in America, you think of finance, right? You think of the big American banks and asset managers and insurers. Manufacturing is way down the list. You think of China in the context of manufacturing. So it makes sense to me in that context, Vidisha, that we will go through a similar upheaval. If we might not go through it in 2026, but if it's not 26, I'm pretty sure in the next 3 to 4 years, the upheaval will be upon us. It doesn't make any sense that for 30, 40 years, the same sector will be at the vanguard of a relatively underdeveloped economy. Today is still one of the poorest 30 nations in the world on per capita income. And it's too early in our economic journey to say that the die is cast and we'll be like this forever. So we've seen in our lifetime America transitioning. We've seen China going from nowhere to becoming the world's preeminent manufacturing hub. So therefore, I don't find it very difficult to believe that we will leave behind the sector which was the basis of our global identity, IT services. The middle class will also have to leave behind a sector which created roughly a million middle class jobs a year. And we have to look forward, right? So John Stuart Mill famously said, countries that progress are the countries that leave the old behind, and with a clear-eyed view on what the future holds, move forward in an assured manner. I think the time has come, and for those watching, if you're the CEO of an Indian company or if you're a leader in our country, I think it behooves all of us to say that this is but natural in a free market economy. We have to transition. The economic pivot is upon us, and we have to transition. And in this transition, we have to give leadership and say that it makes sense for us to move from IT to manufacturing. The combination of the rupee going towards 100 to the dollar, the free trade agreements with America and Europe's fear about China and dependence on China, all of those should play pretty constructively towards us. Combine that with the fact that we produce the best part of 20 lakh engineering graduates a year. Right? If you have 20 lakh engineering graduates, you have a credible manufacturing sector, you have currency in your favor, you have the free trade agreements in your favor, and Europe and America want to reduce their dependence on China. I think you cannot ask for a better setup to ramp manufacturing exports.
Um, I mean, whilst we are speaking about employment growth in the IT sector, one of the most striking charts in your article that I came across, it shows employment growth in the IT sector has slowed dramatically. Now, historically, companies like TCS, Infosys, HCL Tech, and Wipro, they grew revenues at around 16% annually between 2005 and 2020, if I'm not wrong. But in the last 5 years, growth has slowed to around 6 to 7%. What exactly, in your opinion, explains this sharp deacceleration? And is the slowdown, do you think the slowdown is primarily because the global outsourcing market is now maturing? If you could comment on that.
Sure. So you're absolutely right. If you add up the revenues of the big listed Indian IT services companies, a decade ago it was 15, 16%. And they were broadly growing headcount at that rate. They were growing 15, 16% headcount, which translated into at least a million white collar jobs a year. They're now barely growing revenues at 5, 6%. And the headcount addition is by some measures, the headcount addition is almost non-existent over the last 2 to 3 years. There are some other measures who say no, 100,000 or 200,000 jobs have been added, but I haven't seen anybody who claims that a million jobs are added anymore a year. And you can also see the impact of that on graduate recruitment in the engineering colleges, not just the second tier, but even the premier engineering colleges are having trouble now year after year placing their students, right? So so what's driven this? Part of it is the maturity aspect, as you just described, right? In any sector goes through a an S curve, and in the nicer part of the S curve, where the slope, the second derivative is positive, your growth accelerates, and then as the sector mature, growth dissipates away. But I think something else has also happened. The nature of tech spend, the nature of tech spend has moved away from hiring more coders or more IT services firms for coding. It's moved away from that to investing more in hardware, specifically NVIDIA's GPUs, and using that hardware spent to get the AI itself, to get NVIDIA's GPUs and the AI, the large language models, which are fired up by those AIs, to get the LLMs to do a lot more work for the Fortune 500 companies. So they still are doing tech work, just that they're displacing labor with capital. Effectively, they're displacing IT work with AI. The good news for India is a fair bit of this activity is happening in the captive global capability centers of the Fortune 500 companies. So we're not losing all the work, right? We're losing some of it to AI, but some of the work that's being done by AI is also getting done in Hyderabad and Bangalore in the global capability centers of the big Western companies, right? Now this is a familiar story. This is not a new story. We saw exactly the same thing in manufacturing. So manufacturing in the West 150 years ago was intensely labor intensive. Then electricity arrived in 1880. Factories got electrified in America. Factories got electrified between 1880 to roughly 1920, 1920s. Machines started doing increasingly more of the work. The famous Model T Ford production line, Ford's famous plant in River Rouge in Detroit, was the first automated production line in the world. That too was fairly labor intensive, because even though it was a moving production line fired up by the electricity, the workers were the parts fitting the parts onto the Model T Ford. And as we moved towards through the Second World War into the 70s and 80s, those production lines got heavily robotized and automated, right? So if you visit a car factory today, right, including Indian car factories, the amount of labor used is one tenth of what was required 100 years ago. So in manufacturing, it took the best part of a century to move from labor intensive production lines to labor light production lines. And it's actually, even Indian factories are heavily automated. So if you visit an ice cream plant or a dahi or a paneer plant in India, plants that can say supply the entire amount of ice cream for Maharashtra, right, or big state like Maharashtra, will hardly need 50 people, right? A plant that can make all the chocolate that, say, a state like Gujarat wants to eat will hardly need 100 people, right? Because it's heavily mechanized. So the equivalent of that, the same thing is now happening to office work. And naturally, the Fortune 500 companies with their large R&D budgets, with their low cost of capital, are at the vanguard of replacing human beings with technology, with AI, in the context of office work. So for those who want to experience this, if you are in India, call up Amazon's helpline. So my wife and I are active users of Amazon. So if stuff doesn't arrive, we call up the helpline. The person at the other end of the helpline is no longer a human being; it's a bot answering the call. And Indian firms as like Bajaj Finance, have also adopted this technology where they're replacing human beings with bots, right? So we've seen this same story play out in industrial life, and now it's playing out through corporate life, and hence the reduced hiring by the Indian IT services firms, leaving aside the fact that their own top line growth has been hit by the fact that their clients, the Fortune 500 companies, are replacing Indian IT services firms with technology.
Um, I mean, the rise of artificial intelligence, I completely agree with you. It kind of turns out as one of the major structural forces that you've also highlighted in your piece. AI is, as you rightly stated, is increasingly capable of performing tasks that used to require large teams of white collar workers, coding, customer support. Specifically, you gave the example of Amazon and even Bajaj Finance, quality assurance, and back office processing. You even have cited projections suggesting, in your piece, millions of jobs in IT and customer experience could disappear over the next decade. So is India facing a paradox here? That is my question. Next question to you, where automation benefits aging Western economies, but are aging Western economies, but it creates employment challenges for a young country like India. And do you think AI will compress the traditional entry level ladder in IT services, making it even harder for graduates to enter the sector?
So let me start by saying something which worries me, and I suspect if I articulate this properly, will worry your viewers. And then I'll say something which reassures me and hopefully will reassure your viewers. So as we discuss, what we are going through in India is nothing new. Every free market economy goes through this. This is part and parcel creative destruction. Sagar Manthan is part of free market economics, right? What makes our situation unusual, Bidisha, is that in our case, the technology that is displacing labor, the technology is owned by Western companies. So the upsides, so for example, if we use AI to edit this video, right, we are your firm, the print will pay a Western company for that AI. They'll pay a license fee for using the AI, but potentially in the process there could be video editors, human video editors who might not get the amount of work that they would like to get, right? So in the Western context, in the American context, Edison made money as electricity proliferated to America. His company General Electric made money, and some American lamp makers or candle makers lost their jobs. But it was a wealth transfer or economic activity transfer within America, right? The candle maker lost his job. Thomas Edison became a wealthy man, or General Electric became a large company, and it was a wealth transfer within. In our case, what's happening is it's a transfer of economic activity from people in our country to Silicon Valley, right? And this is what makes the current situation a little different from what happened in the West. Right now, let's focus on the reassuring part. Every industrial revolution goes through broadly two phases: a substitution phase, where people are replaced by technology, and we are going through that in our country. We've gone through that in our factories for the last 20 years, right? So in our forthcoming book, Breakpoint, we cite data that Indian factories have replaced human beings with technology for the last generation or so. Now Indian offices are beginning to do so. But then what comes next is complementarity effects, right? And I suspect the complementarity effects for India will take a few years to come, maybe 20, 28, 29. But when they come, I think they'll be big. Now, the nature of complementarity effects is such that it's very difficult to second guess what the new jobs or the new professions will be. But in our book Breakpoint, we are hazarding a guess that there will be jobs created around cleaning up data, labeling data, training bots. And since our bot trainers in India, basically our programmers in India, will be far cheaper than programmers in Europe and America, we might end up with Indians doing most of the world's bot training, right? So the near term piece is worrying because we are replacing Western technology and that's displacing Indian jobs. The upside of that is going to the West in the near term. But 3 to 4 years, I think the picture becomes a little bit more reassuring because I think complementarity effects will kick in. By that time, I suspect the Indian manufacturing sector will also have kicked on the back of a weaker rupee, free trade agreements, and the West's desire to substitute China to some extent in the manufacturing of phones, medical equipment, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, auto ancillaries, industrial goods, capital goods, and so on.
Very interesting. In your article, also specifically, because in the previous conversation that we had, we spoke so much about the middle class. I'm quite tempted to ask a question around that as well.
Hmm.
Follow, your argument that this article makes a compelling point about the middle class being at the center of this transition. IT
Yeah.
jobs didn't just create employment, they drove housing demand, they drove retail consumption, demand for cars and consumer durables. And you also reference charts that show a steady slowdown in consumption growth over the past decade. So, according to you, is the Indian middle class consumption story beginning to weaken? Could we see, softening real estate markets in IT-driven cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad? If this trend continues, I'm asking you the second question because usually it kind of follows. So just wanted to hear your view.
Sure. So let's start with the softening consumption point, and then we'll address the real estate point, Vidisha. So on softening consumption, right, the data is actually pretty easy to get. So whether you need consumer durables or you need FMCG or cars, you add up all the listed entities and you do that for the last 20 years, and you can see the downtrend. And it doesn't matter which product you look at, but most middle class consumption items, the downtrend is relatively clear from low double digit volume growth around 2010, 11. We're now down to 2 to 3% volume growth, right? And I used to get a lot of pushback from people saying, "Nay, boss, this is listed companies. They are losing share. There is some miracle happening in unlisted India." So we went away, Vidisha, and we collected data from listed and unlisted. There are third party data providers who aggregate data across listed and unlisted, and it's the same picture. So if you use entire industries FMCG volume growth data, and I'm using FMCG because stuff like noodles and toiletries and personal consumption items are straightforward middle class items. Whether you take listed companies or listed plus unlisted, the picture is relatively similar. Volume growth in the low double digits in 2010, 11, 12, and now down to 2 to 3% in the current era, right? And that's been actually a fairly linear deceleration. It's been a fairly linear deceleration as the squeeze on the middle class kicks in. Real estate is different. Real estate is cyclical, and real estate goes through extended periods of no activity or little activity, very little price growth. If you're unlucky, extended periods of correction, and then it goes through 3, 4, 5 year boom. Right? It's a classic capital goods type cycle, right? So from 2014, 15 to roughly 2020, nothing happened in real estate. Volume levels were low, prices were not moving. Then post COVID, there was an upsurge in real estate activity. The central bank flooded the economy with liquidity, cut rates. Post COVID also drove work from home. And 21, 22, 23, 24, we saw a pretty solid boom in real estate. That boom started dissipating in 25. And now we're doing this podcast in March 26. In March 26, we're hearing the larger developers in the tech cities, such as Bangalore, such as Gurgaon, talk about demand softening, pretty clearly demand softening in Bangalore being, say, a tech city. Hyderabad doesn't have too many listed developers, but when we visit Hyderabad and speak to the real estate developers, the story is the same. Inventory is building up, demand is softening. Pune too doesn't have listed developers, but if you visit Pune's tech hub is called Hinjewadi. The same story. Inventory is building up, and demand is softening. So it does look like what was happening in broader consumption, consumer durables, FMCG, that piece is now rippling through into real estate as well. Now, one way to offset this would be if the RBI could cut rates. RBI cut interest rates by 1.25% in 2025. If they could do so in 26, that could help us. It could help the real estate sector find its feet again. But given where the rupee is, and given what's happening to oil prices, difficult to see how the RBI can cut rates this point in. So in the absence of the RBI cutting rates, and given the structural trends that we are seeing in office employment, in white collar employment, I think it makes sense to say that we've had a good 4 year bull run in real estate, and we're probably now going to have a period of more subdued activity in the real estate sector.
So you spoke about rupee. So I'm kind of tempted, and I found it very insightful because I feel like at this point, whenever we speak about IT services or the middle class or consumption, somewhere this imperative argument kind of gets ignored or probably postponed. This argument about the structural pressure on the Indian rupee as a result of all of this. For decades, IT exports brought in a steady stream of dollars that helped stabilize the currency. Now, if that inflow weakens, because not just because of oil prices or other geopolitical factors, if this inflow weakens, according to you, what does that mean for the future trajectory of the rupee? And could India be entering a period where the rupee gradually depreciates even further to maintain competitiveness?
Yeah, so let's step back and take this piece by piece. So firstly, as you're rightly alluding to, the rupee as it is gives up 3 to 4% of its value every year. There's nothing wrong with that. Our inflation rates are higher than inflation rates, for example, in America. And to offset the higher cost of inflation in our country vis-a-vis the United States, the rupee has to depreciate to keep our exporters competitive, right? Now, at one level, our IT services exports were a curse for our manufacturers, because if you're exporting the best part of $250 billion of IT services, that's nearly 10% of GDP. If you were to look at the Indian economy a decade ago, that would have been 10% of GDP. That means that keeps your currency overvalued relative to what it would have been had those IT services exports not been there. Right? So Vietnam, for example, doesn't have IT services exports, and hence its currency is cheaper by that amount, which means Vietnamese exporters were more competitive compared to Indian exporters, right? So in economics, we call this the Dutch disease. The Dutch disease, because I think the Netherlands found some oil or gas in the 70s, and that made the Dutch guilder very overvalued, and it killed Dutch exports, and hence that's where I think the name Dutch disease came from, right? So we suffered from our version of, let's call it IT services disease, when we were exporting IT services, thus making the currency stronger, thus hampering our manufactured goods exports. Now, if IT services is slowing down, the data suggests it is over the last decade. If IT services slows down, therefore it can't grow exports further. The rupee naturally has to give way, not just the 3-4% historical rate, but perhaps some more to compensate for the fact that manufactured exports now have to pick up the slack. Right now, a lot of people, and this is where it's important that we as economists try to clear the waters. This is a financial identity, right? This is an accounting identity, folks. If we can't export IT services at the rate we would like to, by definition, the rupee has to fall so that the balance of payments balance, right? Unless the RBI is willing to blast through its entire $500 billion of non-gold forex reserves, unless the RBI is willing to blast through that money, which I suspect it isn't, unless the RBI is willing to sacrifice half a trillion dollars of non-gold forex reserves for the balance of payments to balance, the currency has to depreciate to a place where manufactured exports become competitive, right? And that's all I'm banking on as an economist, that the laws of supply demand will hold. If we can't get dollars by selling IT services, we'll have to get dollars through some other means. The logical means to me appear, the line of least resistance appears to be selling manufactured exports to the West, everything from sports goods all the way to cars, motorcycles, auto ancillaries, and so on. But for that to happen, we need the currency to be competitive, somewhere around the 100 to the dollar mark. So we spent a lot of time speaking to lots of manufacturers across the country. Somewhere around the 100 to the dollar mark, we reckon India will be 10% cheaper than China in a range of products. And that's why I think we'll end up at that number, the 100 to the dollar mark, at some stage in the next 2 to 3 years.
We've spoken a lot about, I mean, definitely the imperative bit of currency and IT services and artificial intelligence. But as you rightly spoke about manufacturing exports, your article suggests that you're a Nandita's, of course. I definitely must mention her as well. It suggests that export led manufacturing could become India's next major growth driver. And you've highlighted several factors that could support this transition. As you stated, a depreciating rupee, free trade agreements with the UK and EU, shifts in global supply chains. My question is, it's a very simple question. Why do you believe this moment could favor Indian manufacturing exports? And also, how does India compare, at this juncture with China, with Vietnam, with Bangladesh in terms of tariff advantages and competitiveness? And I'm specifically picking up not just China, but also Vietnam and Bangladesh from the manufacturing point of view. So, which specific sectors do you think will benefit the most?
Sure. So let's just keep it simple. Let's focus on the EU because that trade deal is in the bag. It's a terrific trade deal. Kudos to our Commerce Ministry. I think it's a really, really good trade deal. And provided the Europeans play fair and they don't use things like emissions and um, child labor rules and so on to stop us, if the Europeans play fair, we should be onto a winner here. So let's just use Europe as an example. Let's take textile exports, right? So, as many people who are watching this are probably aware, Bangladesh exports more textiles to Europe than we do by an order of magnitude more. It's not a little bit more, it's 2 to 3 times more, right? Now, why is that, right? What's wrong with us? Why can't we compete with Bangladesh on textile exports? So, first answer was the Bangladeshis had a deal where they were able to sell their textiles to Europe at zero tariffs, whereas we were on 13-14% tariffs, right? So just on the tariffs alone, we were 13-14% at a disadvantage to the Bangladeshis. And naturally, if you're Marks and Spencer in the UK or Primark in UK Ireland or H&M in Europe, I think H&M is Dutch or Swedish, right? Which exact country I forget. Zara in Spain. Why will you pay 13% extra for the same T-shirt compared to what the Bangladeshis paid? So that was the reason Bangladesh was hammering us for decades on textile exports. And in fact, many friends of mine moved their textile factories from India to Bangladesh to avail of the fact that they Bangladeshis had tariff-free access to Europe. So the first benefit we're going to get with the EU FTA is the we also will get from I think June next year, June 27. Indians too will have tariff-free access to Europe. Right, that's the first bit. The second bit was our currency. Remember, for the IT services, due to IT services exports, our currency was stronger than it should have been. That I think that set us back by 3 or 4%. If the currency carries on depreciating, and say between now and June 27, when the FTA goes live, if the currency carries on depreciating, we could potentially be not just at parity with Bangladesh, we could be potentially 5 to 10% cheaper than Bangladesh, right? And from what I'm hearing, it's already making the Bangladeshis worry big time as to what they will do if Tirupur and Coimbatore and Erode, that belt, is cheaper than Bangladesh, right? So that's the second aspect. The first is the tariffs, which were set against us in favor of Bangladesh, and the second was the currency, which was militating against our exports and helping our rivals. Bangladeshis, I don't think, have IT services sector to jack up the value of their currency, right? So those are at its simplest. That's the simple mental model to use. So textile should be a big winner from the EU FTA. The UK FTA is similar. It's a good FTA for us. Again, kudos to our government for negotiating the UK FTA. In fact, I think it's even better than the EU FTA, right? And better because it allows us to buy things like scotch at lower with lower import duties. So for people like me, I'll get my scotch cheaper and also get, I think, cured meats will also become, the duties on cured meats also reduced, right? So jokes apart, textiles is a good template to use. Now other sectors will have similar dynamics. So for example, sports goods, labor intensive things like sports good footwear will also be equally advantaged. One notch less advantage but still benefiting will be industrial products, say air compressors, pistons, auto ancillaries, right? And then one notch less advantage would be things like motorbikes, small cars, and so on, right? Uh, in pharmaceuticals, the Europeans did not levy a tariff on us. So at one level, superficially speaking, even after the FTA, we'll be no better or worse off compared to what we were before. But I reckon we'll be better off because although on pharma itself there were no tariffs, on the intermediates which go into pharma, on the raw materials which go into pharma, we are currently paying a tariff to Europe of around 14-15%, and those go away after June 27, which will mean that our pharma intermediates, our chemicals industry will become far bigger, and that means we will get scale benefits, which will in turn help our pharma companies access raw materials cheaper. So the combination of this is, I think, game changing. Countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and China, which were 12 to 15% cheaper, will now be at parity. Potentially, they'll be behind us if our currency gives way. They'll be behind us. Now, there is another aspect of it. European materials, European manufactured goods will also be able to enter India for the first time without any tariffs. So there will be certain sectors in which the Europeans will gain market share. So, for example, in many types of auto ancillaries, the Europeans are actually cheaper than Indians. So once the tariffs go away, there'll be certain auto ancillaries where the Germans, for example, could gain market share at the expense of Indian auto ancs. So we have to be careful that it's not going to be one-way traffic, right? We'll just be selling our stuff and nothing from them. That's simply not tenable. It's not viable. So there will be stuff we will buy from them. Some of it will be luxury products such as expensive cars and wines and meats and so on. But some of it will be more prosaic industrial products where our domestic manufacturers might have to cede market share.
All right. Another thing that I found interesting in the column was that you make a very fascinating point about the asymmetry between winners and losers, right? Manufacturing hubs such as Coimbatore, Chennai, Surat, Ludhiana, etc., could benefit, but the pain could be felt in the IT-dominated cities like Bangalore, Hyderabad, Pune,
Yeah,
Gurgaon.
yeah.
Are we looking at a redistribution of economic opportunity across Indian regions? I mean, could this reshape, India's urban economic geography over the next decade?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. It breaks my heart to say this, but it does feel like the answer is yes. And you can also already see this in the data, Vidisha. You can already see graduates in India have
Hmm.
much higher unemployment rates than
Yeah.
class 10 or class 12 pass outs, right? So already the labor market is signaling that getting a graduate degree in India is an exercise in futility because the jobs that graduation was meant to lead on to have started vaporizing over the last decade. And I think that'll be even more so the case in the coming decade. So the template with which our strata of society lived its life, which is study hard, go to university, get a job, get promoted. That I think template is broadly broken, and for my children's generation, a very different template would have to be built. There's also the geographic disparity, which we've highlighted in both the blog that we wrote for the print and in our forthcoming book Breakpoint, which is that the IT hubs are very different from the manufacturing hubs. So, for example, Bangalore is the IT hub. Hosur, which is around 50 kilometers away, is the manufacturing hub. Bangalore seems to be at the receiving end of the transition to AI. It'll still be a vibrant city. There'll be plenty to do there. The venture capital industry, I think, will continue to flourish there. But the manufacturing ecosystem in Hosur, I think, will burgeon dramatically as the Sagar Manthan piece kicks in. Coimbatore, ironically, does a little bit of everything. Coimbatore has some IT, but it's an even bigger manufacturing hub. A city like Coimbatore, or a city like Surat, Baroda, prospers mightily. If you guys think about Pune, for those who are watching, think about Pune. Pune's Pimpri, Chinchwad, and Chakan are the major manufacturing belts. I think those belts will prosper mightily. Hinjewadi is the tech. Hinjewadi is the tech part of Pune. I think there might be a few challenges there. Similarly, Gurgaon's manufacturing belt is very different from its IT services belt, and I think Gurgaon too will see its Sagar Manthan. So there's a geographic shift in prosperity, but I think also the type of person who will prosper in the India to come is a person who knows how to work in a factory. She knows how to manufacture. She knows how to engineer products and manufacture products. He or she knows how to manage teams of workers, think about global supply chain processes, think about global control, quality control, drive R&D perhaps in manufacturing. Those are the skill sets of the future that I think will do very well in India. I'm not so sure how many graduates are emerging from our education system with those sorts of skill sets. Most of the graduates, I think, are emerging with a eye on a job in an air conditioned office. And that air conditioned office, I think, is increasingly, I think, vaporizing in our country.
I mean, before I go ahead with my concluding question, I am kind of intrigued about, if you were to advise a young graduate entering the workforce today, what skills or sectors should they then prioritize? Because, you definitely conclude the article with practical advice for individuals, retraining, building financial buffers. But I would like to hear your point of view as to what are going to be those specific skills or sectors that young graduates should prioritize?
So look, I think that's the skill that I've tried to teach myself. It's been difficult. Middle class Bengali with chakri drilled into my head. So it's difficult for me to do this. I'm trying to teach my kids, and in Breakpoint, we try to inculcate the mindset. What I think we need to try to do is think about work rather than jobs. Work and jobs are very different. So just to give a extreme example, 5 years ago, I didn't know that dog walking could be work, right? But now I can see in our building in Mumbai, there are there are 90 flats. Each flat has a pet or two, so there are roughly 100 pets, and there are two full-time dog walkers who go to people's houses, ring the bell, take the dog out for a walk, and in the morning and evening they are fully employed doing dog walking. In the middle of the day, they sit in the park and play on their mobile phones. So it's a I mean, it's a profession now which earns them 3-4 lakhs a year. Dog walking in Mumbai can fetch you 3-4 lakhs a year. By the way, not that dissimilar to the entry level salary of a IT graduate entering the Indian workforce, right? So using dog walking is a simple example, but there are plenty more such use cases. So, for example, right, most people I meet in India, they don't see economics as a profession that can pay, and I find it very interesting. They go to prestigious places, study economics, postgraduate level, but when they come out, their view is, well, maybe I need to do an MBA and get a become a management consultant or join the strategy team of a large company. The fact that economics can be work and economics can be lucrative is something that it doesn't exist in our country. So just as dog walking didn't strike me as a profession, but I can see it's an increasingly credible type of work that people can do. I think economics and the application of economics to corporate life, to navigate companies through these transitions, to navigate individuals through these transitions, can be a very lucrative line of work. Similarly, financial advice, as we're discussing, we will see epic upheaval in middle class society, right? Best part of 50 million families, their lives will be turned upside down in the next 10 years. To help them figure out how much money they need to save, how do they need to plan their futures so that they can send their kids abroad to study, so that they can retire peacefully. And that itself is work. There's no a company that is saying we will hire 350 financial advisors, but it is but all but apparent that many of the people watching this podcast need financial advice. They need help in structuring their lives in the absence of an employer giving them the structure, right? So as organized forms of employment gradually dissipate, there'll be need for many different types of support services. There'll be plenty of work in India. Just that work doesn't necessarily mean jobs, right? And that distinction, I think, is what I'm trying to emphasize here. And in Breakpoint, the last one fourth of the book is explaining how different a set of skills we need to thrive, how different a set of skills we'll need in the future relative to the past if we are to thrive in the new India, where there'll be plenty of work, just that there'll be very few jobs.
Right, right. I would like to end with a broader question. India has gone through major economic transitions before. This is not the first time. Liberalization in the 1990s, the IT revolution in the 2000s. My question to you is, are we now witnessing the beginning of the next structural chapter in India's economic story? And if historians look back, 20 years from now, what do you think they will say defined this moment of transition?
I think we are looking at the structural transition. I have no doubt, right? I have no doubt this is a transition. In effect, if when historians look back, they will say that that 35 year period post 91 was a happy accident created by the fact that post independence we created a high quality university system, right? It was a happy accident in the sense that our leaders, I don't think when in the 50s and 60s India invested in the IITs and the IIMs and the engineering education system. I don't think they knew that there would be a IT wave in the 90s which would enrich the country. It just so happened that because we had created a good university system, we could benefit from global telecom wires and the fact that there was labor arbitrage in getting American tech work done in Bangalore, right? So it was a happy coincidence. It defined the country. It created prosperity in Bangalore, Hyderabad, Gurgaon, Pune, etc. But that piece now seems to be behind us, partly because we have done a great job. We've created tapped 30% of the global market, and partly because the era of the West having to send all its office work in at 15-16% annual growth is behind us. There'll still be the world will still exist, but the growth will dissipate, right? So the emblematic shift I thought was Apple arriving in Bangalore in 2022,
A
right?
lot of it
And
is, actually.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, so just think about it. India's manufacturing exports are roughly 300 billion. Apple alone exports $30 billion of that, right? So in the space of 4 years, sort of 3.5 years, 10% of India's exports are a company that didn't manufacture anything in India in 2022. That's the scale of the opportunity that lies ahead of us, right? And Apple did that, chose India after plenty of thought. They were making $250 billion worth of iPhones in China. They started shifting part of that to India. What we still have is a smidgen of what Apple makes. But interestingly, Visha, and I think this is an appropriately happy note to end the discussion on, all of their latest phones, whenever the iPhone 15, 16, 17, whenever the latest iPhone is launched, the first cut is always made in India now, right? And I find it revealing that the world's leading maker of smart electronic equipment, cutting edge electronic equipment, premium electronic equipment, makes its leading product, its market leading, its newest product always in Hosur, right? And Hosur is also adjacent to Bangalore, which was the capital, has been the capital of our IT services ecosystem. I think that's the transition in a nutshell.
Wonderful. I feel like that's quite a happy note to end with. Saurabh, thank you so much for
My
joining
pleasure.
us, for sharing your insights, and you're always very candid. Your discussions and your insights are data driven. So thank you for being so candid at the Print Uninterrupted. And thank you all for joining this podcast. I hope you'll enjoy it as much as we both did. Thank you. Thank you, Saurabh.
Bye bye. Thank you.